The day you walk through that gate, you know you lost something. There are some things in your heart that you can't forget.
We were afraid. You look like the enemy, but we're American citizens.
Imagine someone saying, you need to go to jail because you're Japanese American.
What did I have to do with Japan? Nothing. My family wasn't doing anything wrong, but we were paying for it.
Towers, searchlights, barbed wire fences around us. If they thought we were trying to escape, they had the right to shoot us.
We were stripped of our civil rights. We were stripped of everything. When that happens in America, that is a concentration camp.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
My dad had just purchased a home for $1,500. December 7th is the day we were moving in. And when that news came on, my dad's face, I just saw his face just drop.
Within hours, the FBI began raiding Japanese-American homes up and down the West Coast.
We lived in fear because the FBI came and picked up many of the fathers of the families.
When my father was taken away, I don't think our family knew anything about where he was. This left my mother panicked as to what was going to happen to us.
They were shop owners, language teachers, Buddhist priests, law-abiding citizens. Why the FBI targeted them? They happened to be prominent in the community.
December 7th wasn't when Japanese-American prejudice started. It was decades before that. In the early 1900s, there were alien land laws and exclusion acts that kept out Japanese immigrants, and you could not apply for citizenship if you wanted to.
The majority of Japanese, when they start coming here to this country in the 1860s, were farmers, laborers.
They worked hard, saved, and then invested in an operation in Japantown, starting a restaurant, a laundry, a hotel.
The Japanese lived in pretty much segregated areas like J-towns. So we were fairly isolated and largely unknown.
As long as we were laborers and working for them, no problem. When we became competition, that was a no-no for us. Then resentment, jealousy.
We were called the Yellow Peril. The newspapers, the billboards, everything was anti-Japanese.
The Japanese should be under armed guard to the last man and woman right now, and to hell with habeas corpus.
My parents had a grocery store, and my dad put up a big sign in the front window saying, "We are Americans."
A Jap's a Jap, whether he's an American citizen or not. I don't want any of them.
Our bank accounts were frozen. We could not leave our homes after 8 p.m. Many people had to close down their businesses because of the curfew.
All Japanese should be put in concentration camps for the remainder of the war. We want to keep this a white man's country.
The fate of Japanese Americans was sealed in 1942 when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066.
The West Coast commander designated the entire West Coast as a military exclusion zone, and then said anyone of Japanese ancestry would be excluded from that zone. And so you could be a newborn baby, or you could be a 90-year-old invalid.
2/3 of these Japanese Americans were citizens by birthright. With just a sweep of a pen and a couple words, you're no longer a citizen.
They said aliens and non-aliens, and we thought, who in the Sam Hill is non-aliens? That was us. They didn't dare say American citizens.
The government called it an evacuation. It wasn't an evacuation, it was a forced removal. An evacuation happens when the house is on fire and you've got to run for your safety. That's an evacuation.
To be told that they can only take what they could carry, they didn't even know where they were going. It was very terrifying for my parents.
My dad says, burn everything Japanese. So we start burning and burying everything.
My father, who had a fruit and vegetable stand, 2 of them, he had to close them down.
My parents had just bought a new tractor and delivery truck, and the crops were in. To have all of that just wiped out, taken away from them, was really devastating.
We got rid of our family possessions because General John DeWitt told us that we can only bring that which we can carry. And as a young boy, I couldn't carry very much. Most of the families got rid of everything. My mother and father in 1939 had purchased a General Electric radio, and $100 was big money at that time. They sold it to a policeman on the beat for $5. Working 15, 20, 30 years in America and having it all taken away suddenly.
Always the question is, well, why are they doing this to us? What did we do to deserve this? And of course the answer is our face, our race.
Bainbridge Island was the first community to be rounded up and incarcerated. And they had only a week to prepare, pack, and be ready to leave.
Oh, it was difficult. It really was. I can't even find words to describe the feeling. You know, your home is your safe haven. We were herded onto the ferry and onto the train and never told us where we were going or how long we were going to be gone or anything.
We all got numbers, and we became numbers. We weren't people anymore. We were numbers.
There was nobody that stood up for us from outside of our community. If we dared to try to resist, they probably would have killed everybody, you know, without any hesitation.
The government set up 17 temporary detention facilities on the West Coast.
They drove us out to North Portland, and there we were in the ex-livestock yard.
They're living in horse stalls, and they fully expected my grandparents to be deported because they were resident aliens.
And I remember to this day the pungent odor of manure seeping through the floor, flypaper black with flies, barbed wire circling the building, Army soldiers with fixed bayonet, and I as a 9-year-old looking at that, frightened.
They were saying, well, we're putting you here to protect you from people who might hurt you. Well, why were the guns pointed at us instead of at those people who weren't trying to hurt us?
One day my father was a respectable businessman. He had a wife, a family, a car, a place in this society. He could vote. 2 weeks later, he was a prisoner in a camp surrounded by barbed wire.
We got orders towards the end of August to be ready to move. And they put us on old coal trains.
We were ordered to pull the window shades down. We were not to see where we were going. Headed east, that's all we knew.
It was a 2-day journey. We were covered with soot.
We were then ordered to deboard. We could see a sea of sagebrush. That's all we could see. And suddenly, army barracks. Hundreds and hundreds of army barracks. And somebody said that this is Minidoka.
There was a dust storm when we got off the train, and my mom grabbed my hand. I remember her saying to me, "Joni, this is our new home," and crying.
Minidoka, also called Hunt Camp, was one of 10 incarceration camps built to hold Japanese Americans from the West Coast.
Minidoka was not finished yet, but we had to move in there. And they didn't have the toilets or anything. Nothing was done.
It was really in the middle of nowhere. And there were 44 blocks, each block consisting of 12 barracks. Each barrack was 6 units from A to F. A mess hall in the middle, a laundry room in the middle, and we would eat together, we would shower together, we would do laundry together.
No privacy whatsoever, any place.
Including babies born in camp, the government imprisoned over 120,000 innocent people. Minidoka held over 13,000. Every summer, survivors and their families returned to Minidoka for an annual pilgrimage.
In our family of 5, this was our bedroom and home right here.
See?
5 of us in one room here.
I remember that we hung up blankets to separate, get a little privacy between your sister and yourself and things like that.
We had dust storms constantly, and we had so much dust that it would seep through the walls of the barracks.
When the wind blew, we would just suffocate in our quarters.
During the summertime, it would be boiling hot. In the wintertime, we would freeze. When it rained, we would just be in a slosh of mud.
People say, oh yeah, we complained about the food, we complained about the lodging. That wasn't it. The damage was psychological. Here you were with people, all in various stages of grief. They were in anger, they were in denial, they wanted to prove their loyalty. They were grieving the loss of their lives because their lives were stolen by the government.
My father was so withdrawn, it really destroyed him. I didn't know about suicide at that time, but if there was a way, he may have ended his own life.
There's that 2 Japanese word, shikata ga nai, that means it cannot be helped. Whatever that's happening cannot be helped. And gaman, bearing the unbearable. Those 2 words we were brought up with.
I was born in an American concentration camp. I've been able to do things with my life because of the strength of my parents and their values.
I cannot admire more the pioneering spirit of the first generation. Amongst the hardship and the loss of freedom and being stripped of civil rights, the first generation Issei's and the older Nisei's tried to make it into a livable community.
Everyone took a job, anyone who could work. I mean, they hired firemen and policemen. My mother was a seamstress. I got a job as a waitress.
My grandpa Ozawa He became the block captain. He recruited the people who had restaurants to become the cooks for the block.
Eventually, they had schools and libraries. It was like a regular community.
The mess halls would be decorated beautifully with crepe paper for special occasions, and the young adults and adults would have their dances.
Let me see your batting position.
No, I'm no hitter. The baseball team was terrific. We used to beat the other teams like 21-1. I hate to brag anything, but it was just all Japanese, second generation, and playing against these white kids that's 6 feet. It was a thrill. The whole idea was that we wanted to just play so that we could get out of camp.
After a year and a half, the American government decided we were not spies, we were not dangerous, and they gave us one-day passes. We were able to go beyond the barbed wire.
We were able to leave camp during harvest months, and we worked hard for the Idaho farmers for not very much, pay. But it was, I believe, what saved my father.
In early 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was to be a segregated Japanese-American unit that would fight in Europe. They recognized that they had to have a process for Japanese-Americans to leave the camps.
The government now wanted to enlist young Japanese-American men in the Army and to start moving other incarcerees to civilian life away from the West Coast.
And so they came up with the idea of a loyalty questionnaire.
Questions 27 and 28 were the ones that people talk about a lot. And the first one dealt with, are you willing to fight on behalf of the United States against all foes and enemies? And the second one was, do you swear all allegiance to the United States, and do you forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan?
How can we disavow something we never avowed to in the first place? Our allegiance is to America, and I think that many of them were insulted. How dare you ask me questions like that? I'm as good an American as you.
Those who responded with anything but an unqualified yes, yes, were branded as disloyal and were sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center, a maximum security prison in California.
It was quite an indignation for a lot of our parents to think that they wanted our boys after they had done all that to us. So there was quite a bit of controversy between the parents and the sons.
My dad volunteered without any hesitation because he was an orphan. He didn't have to get approval from his parents. And so he, without question, decided he needed to go. It was really about family honor, about hoping that they could prove their loyalty to this country.
The young man that was in our block, he was put into penitentiary because he refused to join the Army because he says, no, you take us out of our prison here at Minidoka, then I'll go and serve. People will say he brought so much shame to the family, and I don't think of it that way, Courage comes in different forms.
For its size and length of service, the 442nd would become the most decorated unit in American military history.
All the while, their mothers and fathers were incarcerated in an American concentration camp.
2 of my brothers left camp to join the 442nd. And my brother Masaru was killed in action in Italy. 2 weeks before Germany surrendered.
These young men at Minidoka were really celebrated. They were thought of as heroes. Their names were placed on an honor roll.
The loyalty questionnaire marked a turning point. Individuals and families could now apply to leave camp for school, work, or resettlement away from the West Coast. But by December 1944, there were still almost 8,000 people incarcerated at Minidoka.
The exclusion order that kept Japanese Americans off the West Coast was lifted in January 1945.
We were given $25 and a ticket back to Portland, or wherever we came from.
My mother used to tell me they took us there and we didn't want to go. And then they let us go and we had nowhere to go.
My grandfather, like many of the Iseis, lost their homes, their businesses, everything. It was extremely traumatic for him.
People were afraid to go back out into a world where they knew that they would be discriminated against, that they would be hated in many ways.
My teacher hated Japanese. Erase the blackboard, throw out the garbage, wipe up dust. 27 students in the class. I did all the dirty work. She hated me. We faced overt racial prejudice.
There were bullets fired into houses in Seattle. On Vashon Island, someone burned down a Japanese farmhouse.
Throwing rocks at me and being called those names left an indelible mark on me, a feeling of inferiority.
Despite widespread hostility, there were individuals and isolated communities who welcomed their Japanese American neighbors home. Yet, in most places on the West Coast, racism persisted.
My father was this businessman who was quite successful, who now could only become a janitor.
We got married in 1955. We went to rent an apartment, and the manager took one look at us and said, "Sorry, we don't rent to Japs," and banged in the door. That was 10 years after the war ended.
My parents are the generation that went through the Depression, went through the relocation, and then went through the closing of the camps. So they basically started over 3 times.
This is why a lot of the old folks, they were depressed.
It was like a rape of a community. And we behaved like victims. We were in denial. We were silent. We were angry. We committed suicide.
It was something that we kind of shut out of our life because it was more merciful to us to forget than to talk about it.
Within the community, there was a sense that we could be taken again. So do not call attention to ourselves. Do not do bad things, or we all could be taken again.
My parents, they never complained about anything. I don't know what they were feeling, really. I didn't hear a word from them. We didn't talk about it for 40 years. Imagine.
My youngest daughter, it was on December 7th, and she says, "I hate Pearl Harbor Day because everybody turns around and looks at me like I'm the enemy." I said to her, "Honey, your daddy was a World War II hero." And she said, "I thought he fought for Japan." So that was a kind of a revelation to us that we were not doing them a favor by keeping quiet.
I think the civil rights movement in the 60s really shifted things.
The Sansei particularly were saying that the government needed to recognize that what occurred was wrong, that they wanted restitution and an apology.
Jimmy Carter, in his final year in office as president, started a bipartisan commission to look into this 40 years after the fact.
Their findings from this commission was that, one, there was no military necessity, that the causes of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was war hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States.
Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, and it was the official apology and first step toward reparations to survivors only of this tragedy.
3 presidents signed letters of apology, and we got $20,000 each if you were alive when the act was passed.
When that came out, all our parents had died. They're the ones that should have got that money. But most of them all died, and we benefited by it, which is not right, because they're the ones that suffered.
For most, the money wasn't even the issue. The apology was much more valuable.
It really helped me heal. It was like we were finally part of history.
Americans have to understand that freedom is very fragile. It's never to be taken for granted.
I remember on September 11, 2001, watching the news, and I'm hearing, this is our generation's Pearl Harbor. And the first thing that went through my mind was, I hope not.
People used to call me names just on the street, and no one spoke up for me. No one said, hey, you can't call that kid that kind of name. That's wrong. And so the whole notion was, it's okay. It's okay to call these people names. That's the situation that's been created for Muslim Americans today. We, the Japanese, are not going to be taken again. That's done with. But other group will be taken for a different reason to a different place that's essentially the same. When you see the injustice happening, you need to stand up. When you see someone being called names in public, you need to stand up.
The wrongs of the incarceration will be perpetuated unless we do things to prevent it.
Now that I've told you my story, you have a piece of that legacy to stand up. You have a piece. And should it happen again, you cannot claim ignorance. You can either say, yeah, I'm for that, or no, I'm not. And I'm hoping that reason will rule, and they will see that injustices hurt us all.